I'm Jacob Chandler, I'm a sculptor. I create my maquettes in wood and resin, and then eventually they get cast in either bronze or fabricated in steel. My artwork is angular, geometric. It always tries to capture a sense of movement and fluidity through bold straight lines. Large scale artwork is realistically where I started. I used to go to a local scrap metal stockholders and get bits out of their sort of waste bins and weld them all together. So it wasn't until I sort of realised that the practicalities of moving and installing and exhibiting these large scale works wasn't really that feasible. So it was at that point that I scaled stuff down to sort of a more manageable scale. So large scale work isn't necessarily something that I've got into, it's more where I started. Having the joy of being commissioned to do these pieces, now that's where, you know, the freedom really comes in, because it enables me to explore different scales with a budget to back it up that I can't necessarily do off my own back. So I've always been drawn to movement and power and grace, and through reflection and conversations with a client who happens to be a therapist, I've come to realise that there's more to it than just I like movement. I have a couple of health issues. The big one is called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I've got hypermobility spectrum disorder. And alongside that, I've got colitis and chronic fatigue syndrome. And this all came about, I feel, after a very nasty virus that I got. And this was a very tangible tipping point for myself. I went from being a very active young person, you know, I was in drama clubs, I was doing like county trials for different sports, and then almost overnight I became bedbound. So I decided to capture these movements and like power and grace and perfection stems from this time, and it's my way of using sublimation to create a product out of the adversity. I find my work meditative, and you know, it's my zen space despite being a 2-meter square brick cube. But that is, I think, why I desire to capture movement. I think a huge amount of credit has to go to my parents, really. You know, growing up, we were always having something creative to do, whether it would be a case of my mum bringing a bag of clay home for the school holidays. You know, my dad's a product designer by trade, so there was always something practical going on, even if it was just DIY. And they'd, you know, drag us, in some cases kicking and screaming, around galleries and exhibitions. So they were very nurturing, and art was a part of life. But I think when art became something more tangible to me was at Gormley's Lost in Space exhibition at the Hayward. This was an exhibition that you could really be a part of. It started and you entered a big glass cube full of fog, and figures would emerge from that fog just inches away from your face and then disappear back into the fog. And for a for like an 8-year-old kid, that was really exciting. You know, there are other sculptors that I could wax lyrical about. I love Giacometti, I love Lynn Chadwick, Nam Gabo. You know, I could list forever, but I think you can see the influence of all of those artists on my work. So I've got a few pieces in this year's trail. A couple are down in the Dingle. So I've got Poise and Tension 3, and this was my first venture into solid panelled large scale work. And it was a distinct change of my work to date. I'd been producing sort of skeletal wireframe structures up until then, and they were very ethereal. They'd sometimes get lost on the background, you know, if tree limbs interfered. And I loved this sort of interplay between the work and the background. But Poise and Tension 3 is a massive statement. It's bold. It is, you know, depending on the weather, if the light's shining on it, it's really warm and orange, and then it can go really dark and in reflection of the weather if that changes. So that is, it's one of my first large scale pieces, and it's still, I think, one of my favourites. It really has sort of come to be who I am. It's part of my identity, really. The other piece is one from our new series, Explorations of Flatland. And this sort of, in a way, takes me back to this more ethereal work. It's inspired by a novel called Flatland, and it's told from the perspective of a two-dimensional square living in a two-dimensional world. And it's not until he gets flipped out of this two-dimensional plane that he realises that things, his world up until that point was just lines, just line segments. And then he realises that, there's way more to life. And I think as you move around this sculpture, it goes from, at times, the facets will be line segments, and then it will emerge as a figure as you move around it. And I take a great joy in that. How sculpture really can change as you move around it. And I also have another sculpture in the museum, which is the same sort of style as Poise Intention, very dynamic and very bold, but this one's cast in bronze. It's an absolute joy to be part of an exhibition that celebrates art not only at the highest level but also in the community. But to be part of an exhibition with like Matisse and Barbara Hepworth, that opportunity doesn't really come around very often. And to have the whole sort of art scene in Shrewsbury and in the wider area be involved in this is hugely powerful, and there's a real buzz to the town. And I really hope that it's started conversations. I feel that it has, and maybe these conversations can lead to collaborations, and who knows where that will lead.